which is like this thing about consciousness, conscious plans, conscious purpose.
Yeah.
Which is never what's going to happen. What's going to happen is going to the extent that we're open to it, it will be better. Stuff emerges in spontaneous play, interplay.
Yeah, how do you see that interplay today?
Einstein did this little bit of work of thinking, theory. It seemed very unlike Einstein, but it's really beautiful. He was thinking about how the river flow shapes the river banks and how the river banks shape the river flow.
Mm-hmm.
So beautiful, so clear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly the interaction you're talking about, I think. That we make an artificial intelligence in our own image, but that image is a funhouse mirror. We change ourselves to meet the image halfway through the looking glass. You know, we don't know where it's going to go.
Exactly.
It is, as soon as there's this closure of a circuit, and when you have the two terms, you can call one the figure and one the ground, but then you can go flip and then you get the other point of view. What was ground is now figure, what was figure is ground. Where was I going with that?
Yeah.
As soon as there is that relationship and a closure, the input of one is the output of the other, the output of that one is the input of that one. They chase each other around like this. They are self-determining, mutually determining, co-evolutionary would be a good word for it. Behavior emergent in time, and you can't predict what's going to happen. So that is the quintessence of an evolutionary system, of an iterated system, of a dynamical system, like in the 1970s, 80s, we learned about chaos theory. And we saw all those swirly, very fluid-looking images. And everything went infinite. I guess it was 1980, was it? 1980? I think it was 1980 when Mandelbrot first got a plot of the famous Mandelbrot set. Well, it kind of contains all the chaos stuff in it. It is the grand map of chaos theory, which is the grand map of really what they used to call 100-odd years ago, the theory of equations.
Don't get too technical and mathematical.
That's a little technical. As soon as
mathematicians.
That's right. It frightens them.
No, but you can't assume that people understand now what you just said.
Well, if we stay close to the idea of a circuit, a loop, that helps.
Okay, can you give an example of that circle closure? Like when the closure happens, you know, with regard to AI and humans, or...
Well, here's one thing. The first thing that comes to mind is Salvador Dali with his paranoid critical method. You're looking at the visual environment. You see shapes, colors, light and dark. You may see things that aren't there, but are just interpretations of what is there. You know, like this microphone with this piece of cloth and that glass. It looks like some kind of bird. That interpretation itself could feed back upon itself, and in fact it must do, for it to cohere as something that I can name, I can designate, I can recognize as a thing. It has already iterated so many times in its own little dynamical system in my nervous system. It reinforced itself. A little bit of evidence says, oh, it's kind of like this, and that suggests to the neighboring, whatever they are.
Can you give such an example with respect to AI and...
I could point to the work that was done, I think 1.5 2 years ago, out of Google. Some engineers at Google, some young pups, bright young things, came up with what they call deep dreaming. And it used what we would call feature detectors, things that recognize little parts of visual images. And it's been trained on huge databases of millions and millions of images. And then beginning with a random seed, a random, you know, like a Rorschach test, like just throwing some ink or color on a surface, and then it starts to see what's there. And that feeds back to itself, which reaffirms what it thinks is there. And then it's into this emerging out of initial random state, out of this initial random chaos, in the classic sense, tohu bohu. You get pagodas turning into what they call slug puppies, you know, you get all this psychedelic imagery, and people saw that and just went, what? Because the last time they'd seen that stuff, they were stoned on LSD. Which just proves what they were saying about Silicon Valley, I guess. But
how does it affect our thinking about things or our perception of things? How does it affect our minds?
Well, the term psychedelic means mind manifesting. And when we see a deep dreaming image, we are seeing mind manifesting. And the resemblance to the imagery that was seen by people doing psychedelic drugs, or engaged in meditative practices, there's a sensitization to texture and pattern. Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception, he has this wonderful bit where he's talking about the history of Western art is really the history of draperies. Because if you look at, you know, the square inches of paint devoted to draperies as opposed to anything else, it far overwhelms, right? It's just pure abstraction, but nobody saw it. They didn't see it. It's the wallpaper. Wallpaper is inherently very psychedelic. So there is... Oh, and here's something that the Pythagoreans, they would talk about the music of the spheres. And the reason we don't know it's there is because we've heard nothing but that since birth. We are continually hearing the music of the spheres, but we don't know it. Because we're habituated to it, because it's this ongoing, constant thing. And that would be the relationship with these bodies, our own bodies. As to what this might mean to an artificial intelligence, supposing one, I don't know, the whole thing gets a little fishy and weird when we start thinking about, oh, a conscious machine. It's not even necessary to go there, because the only consciousness we can know is the one right here. On the other hand, I can inhabit a machine, I can vicariously augment myself, enhance my own sensorium with extra senses. We can have extrasensory perception. It's artificial, it's a fake. But if you remember the Wim Wenders film, Until the End of the World, it ends with this woman, Claire, in orbit above planet Earth, and she's working as a pattern recognizer, looking at the Earth from space.
Let me ask you, if we could simulate human behavior in a machine to the extent that you can't tell whether it is a human or a machine,
Right.
Would you care if your girlfriend, if she was a machine or a real person? Would it make any difference, and why would it?
Well, I don't know, and I have no.
Yeah.
It's one of those questions. If it happens, then that'll be soon enough to find out what I would do.
Yeah, there is this movie, Her,
Yes, there is.
where
Yeah.
he falls in love with his operating system.
Right.
And just watching that, one easily gets into his head and can imagine being him.
Yeah.
And
Well.
can imagine
yeah.
falling in love with operating system and being dependent in the same way we are and attached and
Yes.
so like if you can play my tune, I don't care if you're a machine or not,
Well,
kind of thing.
Gordon Pask had this nice. There was an art show in London in early 1960s called Cybernetic Serendipity, and Gordon Pask, who was an early British cybernetician, designed a piece called The Colloquy of Mobiles, suspended from the ceiling with motors so they could move around. There were male units and female units. The male units had a light, sort of like the male, as he's shining this big solar light from his center, probing the dark with his light. The female unit is equipped with mirrors, but she has a refined aesthetic sense. She wants to be courted, wooed, sung to, and the male is equipped with vocal organs so it can also sing. So in order to get his light reflected back to himself, which is really what he wants, he has to con a female unit into cooperating with him.
Yes.
So that's just everything we've been talking about in the last couple of minutes is summed up in that piece of art, right? That's a cybernetic mutual loop. It's the riverbank and the river flow, carving out their own behaviors out of time. Something emergent, something evolutionary, something co-evolutionary, something unanticipable. You don't know what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Spontaneous. Spontaneous co-arising. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So, that answers whatever it was you... I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
Whatever it was you asked, yeah. Also, it raises the question, the oldest philosophical question in the book, the question of solipsism. Nobody seems to have a good word for solipsism, right? Solipsism being the philosophical position that only I exist. And other people seem to object strenuously to this assertion. Can't imagine why. Yeah, but no, I've always been very fond of solipsism. I think it rings true to me.
Also.
Well, that we are prisoners in Plato's cave, except there's not just one Plato's cave. Every one of us is trapped in our own unique, idiosyncratic, solipsistic Plato's cave. And the thing about Plato's cave is, I mean, he tells a fairy tale about how one guy, one time, manages to break through and go outside, and he's kind of blinded, but then he learns to see, and, you know, he has discovered the real world. Well, it's just the same plot as this Fassbinder film, right? Except we know the fool. It's just another simulation, right? He's just broken through to another simulation. So, the transcendence of Plato's cave is the realization that there is no possible transcendence of Plato's cave. It's one of those paradoxes. There's no outside. So that can lead to despair, or it can lead to the opposite of despair. And it's just like flipping one of those flip-flops. Which one it'll be.
Mm. And why don't we see it and live accordingly and happily ever after?
I think because we habituate, and conditions change. I mean, things that we did not anticipate happen.
Yeah.
Some of those things piss us off, make us depressed, you know. I mean, all this is all very well, and that's why people snigger at philosophers, because there they are in their cloud cuckoo land, you know, having wonderful conceptions of how things are. And then they have to eat. Or something. It's so inconvenient.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just almost had a really good thought. Oh, yeah. So.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got this thing to say about that cybernetic, and I've used the term loop and cybernetic. There's a quote from Socrates, speaking of philosophers. He said, cybernetics saves ships, goods, and lives. And by cybernetics, he meant the steersman of the ship. And that term was adopted by a scientist named Ampère, whose name we use to signify electrical current. He was an early electrical researcher. So at the time of the French Revolution, he proposed using the term cybernetics for statecraft, the art of guiding the ship of state, which fits in exactly with what Plato was all about. His culminating books are the Laws and the Politics. You know, he saw everything in the context of, wow, okay, how do we manage this unruly mob? You know, he was not fond of democracy. He thought there could be these enlightened few who have been cultivated, who've gone to Plato's school and learned all about the truth.
Yeah.
Not like that unruly mob, you know, those guys.
Yeah, so now, seriously, what about Buddhism?
The best thing I ever heard about Buddhism was from this Robert Thurman, American early adopter of Tibetan Buddhism and proselytizer, you know, and popularizer. So he said that the great thing about Buddhism was, again, it was political and social. It was essentially, what do you do with a surplus population if you don't want to go through this endless cycle of wars, strife, the usual horror show, the same horror show that Karl Marx would like to have awoken us. You know, the business cycle, it's also called. And so Gautama...
That would be the surplus population, the one that goes through the cycles.
Yeah, it goes. The population increases because conditions are good, which makes the conditions bad. The population crashes due to a revolution or a war or just a stock market crash or plague, and you know, all the sins. And if you read about these people back in Athens and Sparta and so on in the old days, they were always having wars. It was terrible. You know, there was mandatory military service.
So what was...
So the good idea of Buddhism was monasticism. Teach people how to meditate, teach them how to sit still, be quiet. Don't move. Don't move a whole lot, and make them like it, you know? Make them think this is the greatest thing to do, is to pretty much do nothing. Yeah. So that was the Buddhist idea. It was also the Christian idea, or the pre-Christian milieu out of which Christianity emerged was like the community with the Dead Sea Scrolls in Egypt, monastic communities, hermits.
Okay, so you are a human.
Apparently.
You have that available to you, and you don't go for it. Why don't you? Why wouldn't you go to a monastery and do nothing?
Well, I'm perfectly happy doing nothing all on my own. I don't take instruction. I don't know. I'm on a trajectory. So...
Okay, take somebody else.
You know, there could be a time in my life when that would be a very attractive idea, and there may have been times in my past when that would have struck me as a very good thing to do. It just never quite... Things didn't line up that way, so...
Take somebody else who is an intelligent person and understands this, thinks this, agrees with this.
Right.
And they but they wouldn't go for it. What do you think is attraction?
Well, I actually, just to change the course of that question a little bit, I do see that living in dormitories, not owning possessions, I mean, apart from a small number of personal effects, things you can pack up in a bag, anything else is just a damn burden. A library is a burden, but it's also lovely to create a library as a collection and share it with other people. People are the joy of life, but they're also a pain in the ass. You want them when you want them, otherwise you don't. And there's no reason all that cannot be accommodated. You know, I mean, we're smart creatures and we're adaptive, which is a blessing and a curse, like everything else that's human. So, but I think dormitories, rent-free, basically, and I think the basic stuff of life, food, shelter, clothing, you know, all that will be free. Money will just evaporate. It's just, that can't happen fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be nice if it could happen in a gentle way rather than catastrophically. You know, so are we going to be smart enough? And it's work for a century, 2 centuries, 5 centuries. It's going to take a while. This world is crashing down right now like it did approximately the year 0. Like Jane Jacobs said, dark age ahead. It's going to be a pretty crazy ride.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can you have a look a little bit
Okay.
there and then just go?
See what this
Talk
says.
about those things.
Okay. Well, we've already touched on the thing about this iterative cybernetic feedback loop as being what perception does when it sees something that's kind of like something and then further draws that out, and it gets firmed up as a solid conviction. This is a that. You know, that's what this is. Yeah. So that's, I think something to appreciate is just the scale of things. That if we're willing to credit consciousness as somehow not being just me, but that I am simply an example of what consciousness is, then there's no reason that consciousness cannot be imaginatively extended to all the modules and subsystems of this sentient being, me, which together confect my perceptions, my thoughts, you know, and then once that imaginative reconstruction of how perception can possibly happen is initiated, then you can keep subdividing and subdividing and subdividing and subdividing until you get down to individual cells in the retina, for example, or in the visual centers of brain, and the subcellular matrix, and the fine structure within there. And there's just more and more and more and more to determine, to discover, which process of discovery is well underway right now.
On what level? Not on individual level.
Not on an individual level. And so there is this interesting coupling between the individual, the person, the phenomenological I, and all the material apparatus, the biochemical apparatus, the social apparatus, the linguistic apparatus, the world as it is that supports this phenomenal being.
Yeah.
The only subject there is.
What did you say first? That there is what?
We're me.
Yes.
I who I am, the phenomenal self.
Yeah.
And I was making a little bit of a witticism there, slight witticism, about the only subject there is. Certainly the only subject I'm interested in. And there's that solipsist again.
Yeah, but what about it? I think I missed.
Oh, it's just the this phenomenal self being rather like the ghost in the machine. If the rest of the apparatus weren't here, I wouldn't be here. And that is the ghost in the machine of artificial intelligence. Now, I didn't watch the whole thing, but there was this Hollywood remake of a well-known Japanese anime called Ghost in the Shell, which is kind of about the same kind of scenario, although, it showed its age. It's about 15 years old. But it's a great trope, the ghost in the machine.
Mm-hmm.
That was used, I think, by Arthur Kessler, title of one of his books. Okay, so you want me to continue looking at this? Marshall McLuhan, who I have a great deal of respect for, it was his position that a change in communications medium signifies, it is symptom and a precipitating part of, it's part and parcel with a change in consciousness. So a change in, he would talk about the electric environment, the thing that was ushered in with radio, telegraphy, television, so forth, the film, the Hollywood film, the world cinema, recording, musical recording, electric light. Electric light was actually one of his favorite examples of a medium that changes everything. Telephone, yeah. So the great monster horror chiller medium change is this computer digitization, and the emergent noosphere of disembodied spirit girdling the planet and extending its tendrils now into the solar system. So it's very easy to see this in apocalyptic terms. Apocalypse not in a negative, catastrophic sense necessarily, but certainly catastrophic in the sense of like a radical change. I think what we get is this enhancement of the individual who can take on then the consciousness of the whole planet, and that consciousness available to every individual born into the human tribe. Mm-hmm. And if that doesn't make them happy, I don't know. They're such a perverse species. But it ought to satisfy them.
I don't think that would. Why would that make you happy? That's knowledge. And
no, it would be experience.
Experience. Mm-hmm.
It would be actually putting on humanity as one's own skin.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And actually, there was a funny Hollywood trash movie this season called Guardians of the Galaxy, Volume 2. It kind of completely sucked, but the villain turns out is kind of like Luke Skywalker and his dad. So the protagonist in this, the hunky guy, he discovers who his father is, and his father is this guy whose name is Ego. And he turns out to be the bad guy. Because what Ego, he figured out his purpose. He had this huge enlightenment experience, and he figured out his purpose. Ego.
Ego did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was to turn the whole universe into himself. So of course they had to kill him, and so on, so on, so on, so on.
But that is what you say.
That's what we want. That's what ego wants. That's what the human being wants. Ego wants to be everything.
And then it can drop itself.
Well, then you would hit that point that Suzuki was talking about, the identity of everything and nothing. Right?
Do you think that will happen? I can see that happening.
Yeah, I can see this happening. I can see the neural prosthetic that would allow putting on... Well, this is what William Gibson described in Neuromancer. The cyber cowboy, Case the cowboy, puts on cyberspace. He inhabits it like a skin. He just puts it on, it's his medium, and he's in it. He's identified with it, and he can maneuver within it, and it's responsive to him, and so forth. And then there's all this story around that, but the striking thing was this image of cyberspace as he called it, this hallucinatory, consensual hallucination matrix of the entire record, data record, cultural record of humankind. And all the business conducted online and blah, blah, blah. It also means confronting what assholes we are. We are really terrible. But we're also kind of great. It's a mixed bag. Yeah. But yes, it does not strike me as implausible that... And this was the motto of the Pythagorean Brotherhood and sisterhood, because they were equal. They were unisex. They were into that, equality, egalitarian. Hen to pan, and I don't know actually a literal translation, but hen is one, to probably is, pan is all. One is all. But it's kind of like the Three Musketeers. One is all is one, All in each is another way to look at it. The totality is present in each part. So it's like the old Hermetic adage, as above, so below. Which seems to violate logic, but is the basic intuition of mathematics. And so Bertrand Russell and his math teacher, Alfred North Whitehead, around the year 1900 had a bash at deriving mathematics from logic, which failed terribly. That was the big crisis in the foundations of mathematics. Kurt Gödel obliterated it completely, took the rug out from under everything that depended upon mathematics actually working. So all of physics, sort of suddenly just goes in poof, dust. Except it didn't. It didn't. It held together even though its foundations were completely rotten, which is a very interesting topology, right? The middle is actually holding, holding up everything else. But if you derive logic from mathematics, from number and geometry, then you're cooking with gas. Then it works. And the essence, the essential core idea of mathematics is the entirety is present in each part. It'll turn your head into a pretzel to try to think about it, but that's what it's good for. Once your head has exploded, and you've scraped it off the ceiling and stuff and reconstructed, then you get good at it after a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the desired lability. Lability is a wonderful word. It means literally something like no beliefs cling to you if you have a labile awareness. You can entertain any belief, no matter how crazy, get the enjoyment of it, but it doesn't stick. So lability is much to be desired. Yeah. Well, that was jolly. So did we have enough politics?
Yeah, not so interested in politics.
Yeah, but if we all figure out we're the same person,
Yes.
and we can realize that in the flesh,
Yes.
then probably we might be in a better position to get along.
Okay, yes.
So that has to do with politics.
Yes.
And the other thing about politics, it does not stay divorced from theology.
How so?
Religion and politics are like twins joined at the hips, joined at birth. Castor and Pollux, Cain and Abel,
How so?
Shem and Sean. Well, it would probably take Hegel to explain it. Or maybe Zizek. Or the guy who was reading.
Anyway, I don't see it that way. I mean, they are probably in practice, in the world, in their manifestation, but personally, intimately, say me, I'm totally apolitical.
But how about this?
Which?
Back to the monasticism.
Yes.
The intentional community. What is going to join people in an intentional community that will stick together, that will have a chance of actually holding together? If it's a charismatic individual leader, that's only as good as long as they don't go completely insane, which does tend to happen to charismatic leaders of intentional communities in isolated circumstances. Yeah, it's just not a good recipe. So what's going to hold it together? Maybe a charismatic individual person who isn't there.
Yeah.
Oh, he had to go. Oh, they killed him a long time ago. Oh. Oh, he's much bigger than that. He's more cosmic. I don't know. Something.
Well, a machine. Yeah.
A machine.
Yeah.
Now, that's...
What was the line? All watched over
by machines of loving grace. Yeah, no, that would be the realization of the Godhead in the flesh. Sure. And this gets to Marshall McLuhan was a Christian and had a powerful conversion experience, which was essentially he had this sudden illumination that ordinary perception is the incarnation. The Christians have this doctrine of incarnation, that God becomes flesh, God becomes man. Now, in the person of Jesus Christ, okay, that's their story, but just, it is the nature of human empathic understanding. To understand anything, we have to be identified, self-identified with the thing that we are understanding. So in that sense, any object of our discernment or attention is, that's me.
Mm-hmm.
And the incarnation, just hearing that word, certainly some of those little entelechies I was talking about, the ones that contribute to understanding and perception and so on, that are little tiny swirling monadic little entities, conscious entities, little sentient entities, which make up my sentience. Certainly some of those do not understand the use of any word in a limited context, but they understand it in all contexts, all at once, in the pluripotentiality of being, of possible being. That's what's sort of on the other side of that flimsiest of screens that William James would talk about.
I am going to write that book.
Which one?
The one that starts with a word and then takes
Oh, yes.
the definition of that word, and it just grows.
Yes.
Especially.
Yes. Well, that's what, yeah, that's exactly right. So anyway, this term incarnation can't be heard without it evoking at some level below consciousness or above consciousness, above the waterline of consciousness. But at some point, it's going to be understood as my incarnation. And there's that wonderful science fiction story, very short story, by Terry Bisson called They're Made Out of Meat. So we're made out of meat. Mm-hmm. And we are the incarnation of the Godhead as meat. Yes.
This water level.
The threshold of consciousness.
Yeah, it reminded me of that event that I told you about that was so huge for me on the beach.
Ah, right. Yes.
Where I could, I was in that lake, all alone, late afternoon, nobody around. I swam to the middle of the lake, and then I was surrounded by woods, and that was it. And the water was very quiet, and everything was still. And I leveled my eyes with the surface. Never had that perspective before, right?
You're right at the half and half.
It's close and far.
Yeah. Yes.
In my eye at the same time.
Yes.
And I was trying to imagine that how would it be if I was all alone in the world?
Right.
Meaning really the only human in the world. And I couldn't imagine it. And I couldn't imagine it because I said, why can't I imagine? It just, because it just cannot be. I couldn't be.
So that's very interesting.
It's interesting to me that I could not imagine it, and I figured out that it is because it cannot be.
That's right.
You know how we can imagine impossible things?
Yeah.
And somehow they can be on some in some aspect of them, but this just could not be. And what is it? The consciousness. If I was the only human on the planet, I would not be conscious. It would not be possible.
Right.
And then I was thinking about it, but this is me thinking, like, why? But still this half contemplative thinking, you know, not entirely rational, just rational. And then I could see and intuit that where consciousness comes from, that it is a social thing. So that was
it's beautiful.
That was a very interesting experience that stayed with me.
And it seemed like my favorite word, synecdoche, the idea that you're right at this waterline, you're right at the midpoint.
Yeah.
Midpoint between the unconscious and the conscious, and between the near and the far.
Above and below.
Yeah, you were
and
right.
In front of me, horizon.
Yep.
And around me, a circle.
Yep.
I'm surrounded with, I just had perfect conditions for that contemplation.
Yeah.
Okay, let's, can we do a little bit more, or?
Well, I just wanted to remark on this experience at the lake and this discovery of the codependence with all people. A couple of things. One was just in the wonderful world of the future, if people are able to take on this global consciousness of simultaneity, being everybody, being everything, being the sum total of it all, what does that do to solipsism? You know, it's a joke, kind of. It flips between, well, it's the identity of nothing and everything again.
You know, with my Swedish beach event, I was never the same after that.
Right.
It did change something.
Yeah.
Not thinking so much of me, like when I think about death.
Right.
I think, well, I'm not going to die because other people are going to stay alive.
Yes,
there is no thought.
As my granny,
thought that won't be out there or feeling felt, or just one instance of that, and it goes on.
It goes on.
It did change my view internally.
Yeah. Nothing ends.